Excuse me. So, certainly one of the most unfortunate pages of our country's history took place on the frozen hills of South Dakota on December 29, 1890. I was wrong. 1890. And it came to be known as the Battle of Wounded Knee. But if we called it the Massacre of Wounded Knee, it would probably be way more correct. I've asked, Dale knows a lot about this, and he's got his AI Google going. And I asked him, please to weigh in, and any of you, please weigh in. Add to our knowledge of this. So it turns out that the United States 7th Cavalry had been given orders by the government to move the last encampment of Sioux Indians to move them further west.
Lakota, the Lakota Sioux.
The Lakota Sioux. Okay, thank you. The Lakota Sioux. Chief Bigfoot and his braves were ordered by the soldiers to give up their rifles, and everything was going fine until we're told one young brave who was deaf did not understand the order to give up his rifle. A fight ensued. The weapon was fired, probably accidentally. Began a melee that ended up in 153 elderly men, women, and children dead. Very, very sad. Adding to the tragedy was that the 100 Native Americans that were able to escape perished in a blizzard that followed that night, and their frozen bodies were buried in a mass grave 3 days later. This is a hard picture to see. Other reports put the number much higher, saying that maybe 300 to 350 members of Bigfoot's band died that night in the blizzard. So you're probably wondering, because we always talk about things related to Jackson County history, what does Jackson County have to do with this now almost 134 years later? Well, there is a connection, and it's a reoccurring theme, at least for us here at the museum, because after that battle, the Army captured collected the native rifles, the Indian rifles that were there. Eyewitnesses claimed that when this started, that there were only 2 rifles in sight, but they were told later that a lot of the braves had rifles under their blankets. It was very cold, and they had their blankets around them, and they had pulled guns from under their blankets. So we don't know how many weapons there were. We do know that after the dust settled, the weapons were all gathered, and they were tagged with the name of the brave that they were taken from, and they were sent to the U.S. Armory in Springfield, Massachusetts. They were sent there to be curated, and they were kept there for an undetermined time. We haven't been able to figure out how long that was, and then they were sent to the Rock Island Arsenal. So the Army claimed that there were 8 captured. Sorry, I needed to. Okay. The Army claimed that there were 8 captured Indian arms from the Battle of Wounded Knee that were presented to Professor J.W. Ellis of Maquoketa by the Rock Island Arsenal, and that this was done on May 18th of 1897. And this was the little certificate that went with each of those rifles that came to Maquoketa. Talking to the curator that's at the arsenal now, she believes, well, I think it's a he now, he believes that this is a counterfeit, certificate. Why do you think it might be? What do you see that's not quite right there? Can you see? Am I in the way?
The spelling of arsenal.
Right. Arsenal is not spelled right. And they thought that that was highly unlikely that that would have happened, and that perhaps this is was just a counterfeit thing. Okay. Dale.
To lead up to this massacre at Wounded Knee,
Please.
you have to realize that Custer's Bighorn occurred before this. And so the 7th Cavalry was being led by Captain John Forsyth, who was He was the one that never made it to the Custer battlefield, but his troops were back on another hill when Custer asked for him to come to the battle. He was busy fighting Sioux on another hillside. And that's why he wasn't massacred at this battle. And so there was an incredible urge for revenge for the Bighorn battle. And the natives, they did a dance, I believe it was Nanasana, and the whites call it the ghost dance, and it scared the whites extremely. It just put fear in the whites, because the natives, the Lakota Sioux, believed that this dance, the living could speak with the perished and communicate with their family this way that wasn't here anymore. But this dance to the whites, it was as if the devils were dancing in the field, and it scared them to death. And so when Forsyth led in there, it shows the few rifles that the Indians had. I could look up the numbers of troops, and I'll guarantee you there were a few thousand. And they didn't just have the rifles, they used a Hotchkiss cannon that had just been developed. And this cannon was wheeled in with their horses, and they bombarded them with the cannons before they went in and shot them in their teepees, and as they were running for their lives.
Thank you. All right. Another thing to keep in mind as we're talking about this is our friend Professor J.W. Ellis from the Ellisonian Museum. Also, he fought in the Civil War. From the time he was 16, he came back home. His parents made him come back home because of his age, because he was needed. He went back to fight again, fought in a couple of significant battles. And then he went to the Western Front and he fought in the Indian Wars. And he actually fought with Custer and was recommended for promotions by Custer. So just kind of keep all these little tie-ins in mind, because they're all really important. Thank you, Dale. Okay, so this is a 1902, and I know it's very poor, so I tried to make it the best I could see it. This is a copy of the Washington Post, Washington D.C. Post, 1902. And it maybe explains a little bit about why rifles from the Battle of Wounded Knee might end up in Maquoketa, Iowa. And that's because J.W. Ellis had started his Ellisonian Museum. He started his Ellisonian Museum, like we said before, about the same time that the United States was starting the Smithsonian Institute. And they worked hand in hand, back and forth. And this will show you that J.W. Ellis had established a reputation for himself far beyond Jackson County. To people away from here, he was a war hero, like I said, having fought in the Civil War at 16, then in the Indian Wars, then with General Custer. He wrote several books about his experiences. So he was known in Washington, he was known all over, and that's one reason why it was easy for him to come across things like this that maybe otherwise he wouldn't have been able to get. In this newspaper article, it talks about him fighting in the battles of the rebellion and with the Indians on the frontier, and it describes him as an enthusiast of history who had gathered a remarkable collection of war relics. So, you remember our Heritage Dinner, and our new friend from the Rock Island Arsenal, Bob Foster, who is an expert on weapons of war, and he gave a program about our Spanish-American War canon, right? And while I was talking to him, he happened to mention that his favorite weapon in the vast collection of weapons that they have at the Rock Island Arsenal was one rifle from the Battle of Wounded Knee. So, aha, here's a source, right? So we had a long talk about this, and he explained to me that back in that time, because this sounded like a very difficult thing to me, but he explained that, back in the time, the arsenal had thousands of different weapons that came to them, things of this type, and they weren't able to keep every one. Many of them were sold or they were transferred to people like J.W. Ellis. Record keeping was poor, so even though there may have been records, even misspelled ones, there may not have been, and even if there were records, how many of them really survived down through the years. So our friend Bob Foster found it extremely easy to believe that these 8 rifles taken from the Dead Braes in South Dakota would end up in Maquoketa, Iowa. So, he knows personally, and this helped me out a little bit, he knows personally the older arsenal curator that was involved in researching when we first found out about these weapons. He found her to be an exceptional curator, very, very diligent in her searches and things, and he thought that she had probably examined all the files at the arsenal so well that there would be very little, because I was asking him for help, very little more that he would be able to find about this, but he did promise to try. So he is going to, as he comes across things at the arsenal, he'll be in touch with us. So as we were working with, several years ago, as we were working with the curator from the arsenal, we were taught that the Rock Island Arsenal had a collection of 98 Indian weapons that had been there since their museum opened in 1905. I don't know if any of you have been to the museum at the Rock Island Arsenal. They have a huge, huge collection of military weapons. And, but it started in 1905, and the weapons from the Battle of Wounded Knee would have gotten there earlier than that. Well, when they collected all of these rifles after the dust settled, like I said, they were studied at the Springfield Armory in Springfield, Massachusetts. They don't know the date that they got there, but now they've changed they've kind of changed their thinking, because since Ellis got the weapons in 1997, it would indicate that weapons were stored there before 1997, and up until then they had said no, it was 1905. So they're changing their thinking a little bit, and they're definitely looking for answers, because they, like us, get a lot of questions about the rifles from the Battle of Wounded Knee. So there's also a letter in our files from 1991, before I ever came here, and it is from the Rock Island Arsenal curator, and she's replying to, in this letter, she's replying to requests that she's getting from the general public here and there about these weapons. And so she's writing to the Jackson County Historical Society asking, can we help them? What do we know about these weapons? And that's how we have gotten involved in all of this. One thing that everybody who collects these guns has been looking for is something called the Catalog Frank E. Ellis Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology of Maquoketa, Iowa. They're looking for this catalog and hoping that we might have a copy of it. We do not, I don't believe, have a copy of this. They knew, like we knew, that collection, that J.W. Ellis's collection from the Ellisonian Museum had been sold, and that they thought that this catalog either existed before that or it was printed for use at the auction where everything went. And they, at this time, the Rock Island Arsenal in 1991, knew of only one person that had purchased one of these 8 rifles. Okay, so along with the rifle came this that we saw before, and a tag from the missing, or from the Indian from which it was taken. The person that they knew of was looking for weapon number 3, which was taken from the body of Tumu. And so they emailed us the photos that were sent to them by this Richmond, Virginia man who had purchased this gun. Now, why would he be doing this? Well, he was trying, of course, to get more history on the weapon that he bought, because that would make it worth more, and they were very, very expensive. So he was trying to validate what he had, and that's why all this has been going on. So this is a very small little piece of paper, and I tried to write what it said there, so if you can't read it, kind of there is. This is what the arsenal is calling a certificate of verification. And it's said to be a verbatim, handwritten certificate copy from the Frank Ellis catalog that everybody is looking for. If we could verify these items, then of course everything would be much more valuable. Well, the arsenal curator that I mentioned, that was very, very good at her job, she was able to confirm that the man who signed this, by the name of, it says SD, but she says his name was FD Sieberling. She confirmed that back then he was the assistant foreman of the storehouse, and that he was employed at the Rock Island Arsenal at the time that these guns were reportedly captured at the Battle of Wounded Knee. So we were on the right track here. This man was there when these weapons came in. And she also commented on something else. So we're going to go back to the picture of the rifle. Okay, so you can see that this person who bought this rifle paid somewhere between $15,000 to $25,000 for this gun. Right? This was the curator's comments about the condition of the gun. It was said to be in fair condition. But she said, I have shown you the modeled round gray patina with minor spotting, which would be on the wood stock. The saddle ring bar had been removed, as well as the rear sight elevation bar. The serial numbers were missing. The stock had cracks, dings, and scratches, and some wood missing near the lock plate. And though these details seem harsh, the reality is that it adds up to the fact that this historic Springfield carbine was being used by the Indians, and it helps to authenticate the fact that was so. And why would that be? If an Indian had this rifle and it was in this kind of condition,
well, I'm sure that they would, any arms that the Indians got from white men, they had ground those serial numbers off so they couldn't be traced back to those white men who would have been prosecuted for
Right.
giving the natives arms.
right?
I was also reading that when the battle first started, they had gone in to disarm the Indians.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a deaf native named
Right.
Black Coyote.
Oh, I didn't know his name. Okay.
Yeah, Black Coyote. And they went to take his arm, and he couldn't hear.
Uh-huh.
He was deaf, and he argued that I bought this rifle. This is my rifle. I just paid for it, and it went off. And that's when they just started shooting everybody.
Right. That was the unfortunate accident. Okay, so if this had been a rifle owned by or used or by a U.S. cavalry person,
It would have had the numbers.
it would have the numbers, and it would have been in much better condition
Oh yeah.
because it would have been well cared for. So this curator said all of this is really good evidence that is where this came from. Okay, so like I say, we have had several, maybe four, is that several? Maybe four people through time that have contacted us about these weapons. And the last one was a researcher, and he was looking for information about both J.W. Ellis and his son Frank Ellis's contribution to Iowa archaeology. That's what he was looking for. So anyway, this is kind of all we know about the rifles from the Battle of Wounded Knee as far as how they got here, and they probably were here. I mean, I think we know for sure that 8 of them were here. They were in the Ellisonian Museum. He had just a wonderful world-known collection of such things, and so I think that's a given fact. So, any other comments about the rifles or
Do they
Joy?
still have all those guns?
No. Sadly, no. And that's one of the big mysteries. Ernie?
Yeah, when my family and I visited Crazy Horse's monument, they talked about Wounded Knee, and
Did they?
yes,
Yeah.
Right. Really
It
a
was really
sad,
interesting.
Do we know where any of the rifles are now?
we do, it's pretty interesting. We know a man that has 3 of them. I mean, he calls here often. We know a man that has 3. We've heard from 2 other people that each have 1, and then the Rock Island Arsenal knew then in 1991, knew of 1 man, and maybe there are more. Okay, so Bart?
I will just say, as Bonnie well knows, I've been going through old newspapers, and they periodically list who donated what to the Ellisonian Museum. I kind of came to a standstill. I'm going to go back and work on it, but so far there has been no mention of any
Yes.
rifles received from the government or whoever. But I think that same man has probably contacted the genealogy chapter, or maybe we got the email from you, I don't know, but he's hoping that I will find someplace in there that
Sure.
the guns were donated to the museum.
Sure.
Maybe.
Everybody's looking for that. I just wanted to call your attention at the, well, maybe I didn't put it on there. At the very bottom, there is reference to a weapon that they also had, I can't see it from here, a weapon that they also had at the Rock Island Arsenal that was years later dug out of the mud at the Battle of, not Wounded Knee, the other one.
Little Bighorn?
Yeah, thank you. The Battle of Little Bighorn. So they also have that gun, but it was not picked up at the time. It was found buried in the mud later. So the Rock Island Arsenal has a wonderful, wonderful collection of such things. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about James Whitcomb Ellis and the part that he played in all of this. I think we think about him today. He lived in Jackson County, and we think, he was just a historian from Jackson County. They wrote the 1910 Ellis history books, and we don't really look at his early days. Okay, so let's kind of take a little look about what we might know about him. A lot of, and I think in fairness, we just have to say that a lot of what's written about him comes from his own pen. And he kind of self-aggrandizes, I do believe. So, you have to, I'm sorry?
Tall tales?
Maybe, yes. So we kind of have to take a little of that into consideration, and that happens a lot of times, and that's one reason why our 1889 Jackson County history book, portrait and biographical album that tells about all the great people that lived in Jackson County, and you read that and you think, well, why isn't this person in there and why isn't that person in there? And it's because you had to pay to be in it, and you had to supply the information, and there were just a lot of very deserving people that weren't going to toot their own horn. They weren't going to do that. And so maybe that's something that we need to remember, and we'll see as we go along about J.W. Ellis. Okay, so, okay, so there are his parents. His father was Jesse Ellis, who grew up on a Kentucky farm, and he came to Jackson County in 1852 when J.W. Ellis was only 4 years old. So Jesse bought 160 acres of land in South Fork Township, so he lived out by Hurstville, right? And he lived there until he died in 1889. I think that's his father. This would have, like I said, been in the Hurstville area. We know that Native Americans lived there. It was only natural that he would grow up as a little boy looking for arrowheads and being really interested in things like that. We also need to remember that Hurstville in 1905 had a lot more families than it did later on. It was a busy, growing place with a lot going on, and we do know that up on the bluff there was a Native American burial ground as well. So J.W. Ellis attended country schools until he was 14 years old, And during that time, he tried to enlist in the Civil War 4 different times. Finally made it when he was 16 years old. He didn't, I think, because his older brother that he adored was killed in the Civil War, and so he felt that that's where he needed to be. He fought in the campaigns from Culpeper to Petersburg, but like I said, he was made to come home by his parents because of his age, so the Army did return him home. He was there for just a short time, but then he was old enough and he enlisted again. He served against the Indians on the frontier in the West. And this is according to the portrait and biographical album of Jackson County. He served his last 3 years under the leadership of the heroic and ill-fated General George Custer. And though he was young, and I'm sure this part is true, though he was young, his coolness and his daring in the face of danger attracted the favorable attention of his brave commander, who twice promoted him and recommended him warmly for a commission. We do know that one of the books that J.W. Ellis wrote about his experiences is almost, not quite, but almost word for word the same as a book written by Custer about his experiences, and so one has to wonder about that too. Here's his wife, Mary Forbes Ellis. After he came home from all of his Indian fighting, etc., he came home to farm, again out at Hurstville. He began buying land and cutting off timber, and he then moved to Maquoketa, and he conducted a very substantial fire insurance business. And in 1907, he moved from the farm into Maquoketa. 1870 was when he married Mary Forbes. She was a daughter of early pioneers, and together they had 9 children. And she's known to have worked enthusiastically for the Old Settler Society until she passed away in 1907, which was the year of their big reunion. So they had 9 children. The one that you hear the most of, maybe the one that stayed in this area that you hear a lot about because he was a businessman in Maquoketa, was his son Charles. These are all pictures of Charles, and then Charles's son that was named James Ellis. James, like I say, had a large family, and family was very important to him. And in our collection we have this picture of the Ellis family, and you see J.W. Ellis right there. They lived in a house that is still there, and I think it's on the corner of Otto and Pleasant Street. So it's on Pleasant Street. It's across the street from where Bruce Dean lived, where the Congregational Parsonage was, and I think it's Otto Street. It's a house that they just worked on and just remodeled, but it's still standing there. Do I have the right, is it Otto Street? I think it, do you think so? I don't know. Don likes to tell the story about the alligator that he kept in the basement of that house. He says it used to get out occasionally and be found walking up and down Main Street. We do know that there was a kitchen fire in that house at one time, and his daughter Jessie Albright lived there after he was gone, and the Albright family donated to the museum woodcuts. Woodcuts are photographs, and they're the photographs that were used in the 1910 history book, and they're very wonderful. We're very excited and to have those in our collection at the museum, but they have, a couple of them are a little charred, and so they were in that kitchen. They were in that kitchen fire. His daughter lived here for quite a while. She had 2 children, Richard Albright, who was a member of the Historical Society, and when our theme for 2010, which would have been the 100th anniversary of the 1910 histories that Ellis wrote, our theme was about James W. Ellis and his grandson Richard came back. When I came here on our rolls for membership of the Historical Society, there was always a Ramona from California, never a last name, just a Ramona. And for a long time, I didn't know who Ramona was, but Ramona was a granddaughter of J.W. Ellis. So they've been close to the Historical Society for a long time. One of the things that J.W. Ellis did was he was a Justice of the Peace. He was president of the South Fork Township School Board for over 20 years. He was always interested in education, and he was interested in all things military. And he served on the Soldiers Relief Commission. He was a commander of the A.W. Drips Post, the GAR. He was the GAR commander of the Drips Post of the GAR. He was commander of the Iowa Union Veterans Union, and he was honored with the second highest office in that organization, which was a nationwide office, and he was, when he was chosen as deputy commander-in-chief of the national command of that order. So J.W. Ellis was somebody, and he did some really great things. We know he was always interested in historical research, and he was secretary and treasurer of the Maquoketa Valley Pioneer and Old Settlers Society for nearly 20 years. He was really active in getting pensions for some of the old soldiers and for getting them admitted to the soldiers' homes when they needed to be. Maybe one of his crowning achievements was the homecoming that he organized for in 1907. He wrote to people who had lived here over the years, people who settled this area, and he brought many, many people home. It was a huge success and a huge celebration that went on for many days. He sent, and this was his envelope that he designed. We have some of these envelopes in our collection, and he used these envelopes to send out his letter to people who had lived here and been part of Jackson County history all the years, and then had maybe moved away. And so many, hundreds and hundreds of these people came back for this celebration in 1907. He did such a great job that in appreciation he was given a beautiful silver tea set, I guess, which he always was very, very proud of and very glad to have. Another thing that J.W. Ellis did had to do with Thomas Cox. He was instrumental in erecting a monument to the Honorable Thomas Cox, who was a pioneer lawmaker. And I'm sure that I think that you know that probably Thomas Cox, if he had not died, would have been the first governor of Iowa instead of Ansel Briggs. So this stone was placed in Mount Hope Cemetery. Thomas Cox was kind of the founder of Bridgeport, and he was trying to make Bridgeport into a booming town. That never quite happened. But he was buried near his cabin there under a big tree, and his grave was rapidly disintegrating. And so Ellis took action, and he had him moved to Mount Hope Cemetery and had this wonderful big boulder put there. So hopefully whoops, I can't do it that way. So you can see that there's engraving on this boulder, right? So I wondered why they put this plaque right over the top of it. They placed it right over the stone and the engraving. And then as you look at this and you read the plaque, whose name seems to be the most prominent? Is it the Honorable Colonel Cox, or is it James W. Ellis who made this all happen? So, just another indication that he was self-promoting. But maybe you have to be, I don't know.
I kind of wonder if what's underneath the plaque was maybe like graffiti that was being chipped in there. I saw an RIP, rest in peace, when you were backed away from it, but I couldn't make out all the rest. But,
yeah, I can't.
I wonder if people that just passed through
and they put it there to kind of cover that up. It was definitely engraved it definitely had an inscription, and I've looked at it up in the cemetery. But you're right, you cannot tell exactly what it says. It has another blank side. They could have put this on the other side, but
yeah, it'd be interesting to see what
it was like. Should have gone up and taken a picture, but I couldn't remember quite where it was. Okay, so this is one of the very neat things that he did that he was very proud of. Another thing that J.W. Ellis did was he was elected to the Iowa legislature. He served the residents of Jackson County as their state representative from 1909 to 1913. And there's one of his letterheads from his office. But he used his position well. And maybe the thing, as you read all of his different things, maybe the thing that he was proudest of that he had accomplished was the fact that he used his influence there to get the legislature to appropriate $1,000 to erect a monument to honor Ansel Briggs in Andrew. So he got that done. That was a big deal. That was a lot of money back then. He then raised $300 from around the county, and he brought the remains of the governor back from Omaha, Nebraska, where he died, to Andrew, Iowa. And he did this as president of the Jackson County Historical Society. Maybe not president, maybe secretary and treasurer. Okay, but it was kind of an interesting sidelight to note that he always said that he was inspired to do this by his grandmother. And his grandmother had lived with him, but she had known the Briggs family since 1838, when everyone sort of came here. And his grandmother could not abide the fact that the governor was buried far away in Omaha, Nebraska in an unmarked grave, while his wife and children were buried in Andrew, a town where he had lived for 30 years. And so through her influence, he got this stuff, which was pretty neat. Another thing that we have in Maquoketa is the Ellis Block. Okay. Does anybody know very much about the Ellis Block? And I didn't have time to go there, since we were talking about Thanksgiving today. So
I love the architecture, especially at the top.
Isn't it beautiful?
Oh, yeah.
So you know where that is? Copper Cardinal's right over here, right? On this corner. And when that building was all being restored, there was much work done on this building as well. So that's what's known as the Ellis Block. So he was a busy and an influential guy. Okay. So then we go to, so this was the Advanced Hotel. And I think it was on Pleasant Street in Maquoketa. Fine looking building. It was used as a hotel, as a boarding house, and it also contained the dental offices of Dr. Ellis, who was a relative. Barb, do you know how he was related?
I'm sorry, I was trying to look up something about one of the guys you were talking about.
Okay, sorry. So can you tell us how the dentist Ellis is related to, I don't know how they're related, but there is a relationship.
I don't really know of.
Okay, and I thought, I don't know either. Okay, so anyway, we know they were related, and also in this very nice building, he had the Ellisonian Museum somewhere on the top floor. That's where all of his things were. And we have another photograph of that building on Pleasant Street in Maquoketa, and it opened in 1893, and we just kind of know what that was. And on the back of the original photograph, it says it's thought that the man standing in front is J.W. Ellis. So, okay. Did that mean something?
No, it's just interesting. I love old photographs.
Okay.
On a computer, I would zoom way in and try to get a look at them.
Yep. Yep.
Is that house still standing?
No. I'm pretty sure it is not still standing.
Okay, because I could.
Yeah. Okay. So, we don't have, it's surprising to me that we don't have more information and more pictures about a lot of the things that were in the Ellisonian Museum. We do have a few things in our museum on the fairgrounds, like fossils and different things like that, but not a lot. He called his museum in the beginning the Ellisonian Institute, but you see on the ticket here, it's Ellisonian Museum. And he also called it a collection of oddities and curiosities, which maybe was unfortunate in a way, because I think that perhaps people tended to take it less seriously then, when you know that some of the things he had were among the best collections in the whole world, like his collection of military weapons and things like that. The reason that he had these very strange things is because he was famous, and people from all around the world sent him things. And we had soldiers that were from here that were fighting in the Spanish-American War, for example, and they were in the Philippines and places, and they would send him shrunken heads and all sorts of very strange things. And maybe he felt out and about. Anyway, he would put those in his museum. But he is said, and this is a quote, he secured almost the largest and most valuable collection of relics and curios in the state, and one of the largest private collections in the world. But they tended to overshadow the more important items. Like I say, this is a picture that's in the 1910 history, and you can see some of the prepared birds. That taxidermy was a big thing, and there was a lot of things like that, but very, very few photos. I thought that the tickets that are in our collection were interesting. This is an earlier one when it was J.W. Ellis, and it was the Ellisonian Museum. And if you can read that, I believe that his son Charles at that time was listed as the proprietor, but L.L. Riggs was listed as the manager. So that's our Dr. L.L. Riggs that is in our Hall of Fame and became very famous. But one of the things he did, he was a professional photographer, he was manager of the Ellisonian Museum. Then if you remember, he owned his own circus and traveled all over the United States, I don't know if all over the world, but certainly into Canada and places like that. And these were just some of his many careers that he had before he actually became a famous doctor here. This is the second ticket. This is the Ellis Museum, and you notice the difference. J.W. Ellis was the Ellisonian Museum. When he passed away, everything went to his son Frank. He died in 1929, and in 1930, his son Frank took what he wanted from his collection to his new Ellis Museum. So then, is there a misspelling?
Yeah, that's ticket on the left. It doesn't say museum, it says Ellisonian Muscum. Or my eyes are worse than I
No,
thought.
it's EU.
Oh, yeah.
It's just strange writing, I think.
Gotcha.
Strange printing, yeah.
Yeah, it
But I
doesn't
can
look like an
see,
E.
yeah, I can see where you might think that. But, so it started out, tickets were 10 cents at one time, then they were raised to the very high price of 25 cents a ticket. So, but Frank Ellis's collection was more serious. He didn't have the oddities and curiosities, didn't have the shrunken heads. His collection centered more on Native American artifacts, of which he had many, including his father's, and weaponry. And so that was kind of the difference between the two. So I don't know if anybody remembers this building. This was the Ellis Museum. He built this building on 2nd Street.
Next to the library.
Yep, next to the library. And you can maybe, would this be the library right there, Bob?
No.
So it would be right next to the library. I had thought that it was where Ken Wright's office is,
No,
but that couldn't
was in
be.
between.
It has to be in between, where the new annex to the library is, all right?
But I
Makes sense.
Is that a Model T?
It looks like it. It does look like it.
it.
But quite an interesting building, right?
Same
So that was the Ellis Museum. And one of the things that's hard for us here is we get questions from people all around, is people mixing up the Ellisonian Museum and the Ellis Museum and what was in which one. Okay, so the other thing that he did was, oops, didn't want to go to that yet. The other thing that J.W. Ellis did, of course, was to write the 1910 two-volume history of Jackson County. And in that, if you read that, he talks about what this collection contained. He said, and I quote, "It contained many relics and interesting articles which were sent to him by American soldiers in the West Indies and in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. His collection of firearms is said to be the best of its kind in the world, and his swords, each with a history, include some used in the Revolutionary War, some in the Napoleonic Wars, and every war that's happened since." He has a splendid fossilized specimens of animal and plant life, costumes and weapons from various lands, implements of industry showing the changes and improvements of 200 years of agriculture, together with autographs from famous people and things like that. But they said, it seems hardly possible that within in one lifetime, one man, without making this his business, should have brought together such a splendid collection, and it is Mr. Ellis's purpose someday to make this a gift to the county. Well, we'd always kind of counted on that these things would always stay in the county. And even his son Frank said that these things would always stay in the county. It would have been nice if his grandson, Frank's son Francis, had known about this, because when his father died, when Frank died, Francis offered it for sale. And as all of you know, it was an all-for-nothing deal. You either took it all or you got nothing. And he offered it to this historical society for $2,000. It's easy to say, and I've said many times, it's easy to say I'd have had a bake sale and we would have bought those things, but that's not what happened. At the time, there was no money to purchase the collection. The Historical Society had no money at all, and they had nowhere to put these things if they had bought them, because at that time, the Pearson building had not been built yet. It was being built, but it wasn't ready, so they wouldn't have had a place to put them anyway. I have wondered so many times how we let these things slip through our fingers, and yet we don't really know what slipped through our fingers. Those of us who remember Lucille Sorensen, she talked often about visiting with Francis, trying to get certain pieces of his collection for the museum. And he just would not budge. A group of local citizens, and these were all great people and great historians, Melvin Joyner, Mary Shriver, Richard Sorensen, Howard Tabor, and Paul Sagers. They evaluated the collection for the Historical Society to determine whether it should be purchased for the sum of $2,000. And they reported that there were many items that would be very interesting to us, such as uniforms, a sword and flag from Jackson County units that fought in the Civil War, hundreds of arrowheads and other Native American artifacts. They had all these things because, you know, like Barbara was saying, in the paper, they would record each week things that were donated and who donated them. Well, people loved getting their name in the paper, right? So they were eager to bring the things that they found in and give them to Alice. And what a wonderful way to advertise. I mean, it was free to him, and so it was a great thing. But he just had so many things, and there were also weapons and other artifacts from the Bellevue War that we certainly would have loved to have had, and we got none of those things. Okay, so in fairness to the decision that these people made, some of the things were from campaigns in the Philippines and Cuba, and they just weren't interested in those things. They weren't Jackson County things, and so, you know, and many of them were just plain oddities with no place in our collection. But the thing that really, it seems to me, clinched their decision not to proceed to get these things was the large collection of birds that were in glass cages. Frank was a taxidermist, and there were glass cases in this building that were full of, and you saw in the one picture, well, sorry, the stork and some of the things. So the committee was told that these things were old, the old way of doing taxidermy. They were filled with formaldehyde and things like that that would be dangerous. that when the glass cases were open, these different things would just go poof, and they'd have nothing left but a pile of dust and feathers. And so they decided not to take advantage of this. And maybe there's other reasons that we didn't know about. So, since Frank did not offer tuition in pieces, on Wednesday, December 21st, 1966, the world-renowned collection left the county and the state. A man by the name of Clark Garrett of West Elkton, Ohio, and Lawrence King of Monroe Center, Illinois, purchased the entire collection for $5,000 from Francis Ellis of Rockford, Illinois. And the plan was to auction them off in 2 different auctions, one in Delaware, Ohio, and the other one in Richmond, Indiana. And, you know, hindsight is wonderful. We understand there was just one auction, but we just now wonder how this could happen, whether it was $2,000 or $5,000. If you knew, or knowing how much just one rifle from the Battle of Wounded Knee would be, you know, probably it would have been worth it. The other thing that we don't know, and we can only surmise, J.W. Ellis had other children. And perhaps some of those things were already taken from the collection by these other children before they got to this rate. And so maybe the rifles of Wounded Knee were already gone by this time. We don't know that. So we have to remember that. Perhaps what they would have ended up with would not have been worth it, though I don't know, those guns from the Bellevue War would have been pretty important to us. But anyway, they made the best decision in our best interest, and that's where we are. So, through the years, attempts have been made to locate this collection. What happened to it? Where did it go? We know that there was an auction, but was everything sold? And it was especially important after a couple of McCoquetons. And I'm thinking it was Sue Spalding and her husband, and maybe Jim, another couple in that area, and they traveled around together. They went to the East Coast. They were somewhere they thought in New York, but they weren't sure. They were in the basement of a very large skyscraper, and they came back and reported seeing huge wooden crates in the basement marked Ellisonian Museum, Maquoketa, Iowa. So maybe they were empty, but they couldn't remember where they saw them. They didn't even report it for a long time. By the time we found out, they couldn't remember. There was no way of, so what might have worked didn't work. No copies of the catalog from Frank Ellis's museum have ever been located. We have never found anything like that, just that one little paper. What we do know is that the 8 rifles from the Battle of Wounded Knee went on the circuit. Okay, they were put out there for public sale. We know that they are all now in the hands of private collectors. We know that those people paid several $1,000s for each one of those weapons, and they're still hungry for information about them, you know, to tell them
And they're
more
worth
about
a lot, much more money now.
Yes. What would you guess? What would you guess?
Well, people with money, it's hard to say what they'll pay for something that
That's
they
true.
really want. They would just keep going up in an auction until they owned them. So it could be several $100,000.
Wow, isn't that something? And to think that all 8 of them were here in the Ellisonian Museum. So we just know, both the Rock Island Arsenal and our little museum here know, people are still looking for information, and we still get inquiries about these. So I think it's important for all of you to know about this. So when you hear something or you see something, you can say something, right? My last picture is of our sword. Okay, this is the Kelsey sword, as you all know. A lot of things ended up on the open market, and you heard when I read that a Civil War sword and a lot of artifacts went with this collection. Perhaps it was our Kelsey sword. This sword was so important to us because, as you know, Captain Ripps led the unit that was put together here in the Civil War. His second in command was Lieutenant Kelsey from Sebula. He was a tinsmith in Sebula. And they led the contingent from Jackson County, and off they went to the Civil War. Before they left, 2 swords were purchased by the residents of Maquoketa, and they were engraved right here on top of the, it has a name that I can't remember right now.
Scabbard.
It's a scabbard, but this has a name. Anyway, that's where the engraving is. But both of them said that they were presented to, and it had their name, by the people of Maquoketa. And so they just disappeared. Well, one of the people that had contacted me often was just, I never met him, but just a really neat guy by the name of Tommy Haas. Tommy Haas was a collector, and he lived in near Salt Lake City, Utah. And he was always interested in the rifle of Wounded Knee. When he contacted me the first time, he only had 1 rifle. Now I know he has 3 of the rifles. So he's been in hot pursuit. He has talked to all of the people at the Rock Island Arsenal, and he's shared with us all of the information that he's found about these rifles. Well, he has a bunch of friends, his cronies. He kind of sounds to me like kind of like a New York, I want to say thug, I shouldn't. You know, just a really rough and tumble, tough guy when he talks to you on the phone. But he ended up with 3 of these. Well, he was out on a road trip with some of his cronies, going around to different auctions and things like that. And he went to the convention center at Las Vegas. And this has just been in the last couple of years. Went to the Las Vegas Convention Center, and he was looking through a table of artifacts, Civil War artifacts that were for sale. And as he looked at them, he saw this sword. And he looked at the engraving and he said, Maquoketa. He's never been here, but he remembered, one of a kind, right? Maquoketa, one of a kind. He remembered Maquoketa, Iowa, and he said, wait, I know about that. So he had to wait until he got back home. When he got back home to Salt Lake, he called me and he said, do you know anything about this sword? Oh, yes I did. And so we had a long conversation. Tommy Haas got back in his car, went back to Las Vegas, and I know you've heard this story because we had a big program about it. He purchased this sword for us. He took it home, he examined it for us, and he is quite the expert. He showed us where this sword had been professionally repaired, right here under this brass plate. Told us all kinds of things about this sword. He packed it up very, very safely, and he shipped it back to us. So, as you know, as a museum, we're not allowed to buy or sell anything, but we talked to the family of Asher Schrader, who agreed that Asher would love it if we would use some of his memorial money. So we paid Tommy back for this sword, and it's now on display at the other museum. Richard Rockroar and buddies made this beautiful case for us, and we're really glad to have it back. But if it weren't for the rifles of Wounded Knee, this wonderful artifact from Jackson County, Iowa would have never come home. So it's just interesting the way things work and the way they just kind of go in circles. And so keep these things in your mind, because you never know, like Tommy Haas, when something's going to pop up and you can say, aha, I know about that, and get things back to where they are. Anyway, that's our story about the rifles from the Battle of Wounded Knee. Thank you, Dale, for all your information. Anything else?
Well, my brother Michael and my older brother Mike and my younger brother Tim are on their way. They're driving. My older brother picked up my brother at O'Hare.
Okay.
And they're on their way here now. I wish he was here earlier because he could tell us everything about the Battle of Wounded Knee and Little Bighorn. He's just a fact. He just is very interested in those times.
Awesome. I wish you so too.
Well, my spouse Sarah, her grandmother, Joanne, was born Joanne Wilson, spelled with 2 S's, in Wyoming. And her uncles have done genealogy on the family, and they claim that she is a direct descendant of a famous Oglala Sioux named Sitting Bull.
Oh,
And there was a second uprising at Wounded Knee. When I was 19
there
years
was.
old, you might have heard the name Dennis Banks and Russell Means. They were unhappy with not the government at the time, they were unhappy with the way the tribe was running the reservation, and so they took it under control. They armed themselves, and they basically in 1973, when I was 19, I don't know what the term would be, but they took control of the reservation.
where was
and
the reservation? In South Dakota or west?
It was in South Dakota, Wounded Knee, I thought.
Is in
was
South Dakota?
South Dakota,
Okay.
yeah,
I thought they moved.
which is where her grandmother
Okay,
roots came from, the Black Hills, that our government wanted so desperately because of the gold there, and the natives refused to give it up because it's their heritage
you bet.
and all their, their ancestors that are buried there. And so they took control of this, and I actually had a good friend whose father at that time in 1973 was the sheriff at Wounded Knee.
Really?
Yes, and the government was insisting that he went in with arms and took it back and basically shot everybody down because they refused to give this up. I think they held it for 70 or 75 days.
Oh my gosh.
And so the government, they were being pressured. You're the sheriff, you need to do something about this. You're making a fool of us, not
Sure.
just sitting there and letting them hold this, And then
Oh my gosh.
finally Russell Means and Dennis Banks gave up and gave their arms up and ended up in prison.
Oh my gosh, thank you for that. You just never know. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving.